Hey everyone, Queen Nerdling here, coming today to talk to you about lipids. So let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, some basics about lipids. They're composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, just like carbohydrates. However, they don't have that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio that carbohydrates have. They have these really long hydrocarbon tails. So lipids are nonpolar hydrocarbon chains, and remember, nonpolar means they don't have a charge. That also means they're going to be hydrophobic, meaning they're scared of water. So they're not going to mix well with water. If you've ever poured oil in a beaker of water, you see that it separates out in those layers. That's that property of being hydrophobic or nonpolar. They also have fused ring structures. We have family groups. So unlike the other biological molecules, they don't necessarily have polymers per se. They have more so groups of lipids. So our family groups of lipids are our fats, which are things that we're probably very familiar with: oil, butter, different types of nuts like cashews and peanuts, different types of oils, so olive oil, avocado oil, grapeseed oil, all kinds of oil, coconut oil. We also have phospholipids, which some people aren't quite as familiar with in thinking of them as a lipid per se. And that's what composes the plasma membranes, or the cell plasma membranes, the phospholipid bilayers of all cells, whether it's a prokaryotic cell or a eukaryotic cell. And then we also have lipids that compose steroids, or all of the hormones that are going on in our bodies right now. So again, the polymers don't technically exist. So as far as the monomer meaning the single unit, we have 3 fatty acid chains and then a glycerol. And so if you look at this, in red, we have the glycerol. And then we have these hydrocarbon chains. Those are very long. So each of these little points right here is going to be a carbon. And that's how we draw them. Because there are so many carbons and so many hydrogens, we don't actually physically write out all of the C's and the H's. You represent it with this. So at each of these points is a carbon, and then we would have hydrogen bonding to the other ends of the carbon. So as far as function, lipids play a very important role in long-term energy storage in the form of fat. So fat gives us a way to make it if we get put into a situation where we can't readily consume food. So we have fat storages, might have some love handle fat storages. So again, that is a long-term energy store. That's something that you dip into if you do extended bouts of exercise. So when you're exercising, you get on a treadmill or you go outside to take a run or bike ride, usually about the first 30 minutes, you're gonna be burning through your carbohydrates. So your quick, fast energy fuel. Once you get through that, sometimes you'll hit what we all know as the wall, where you're going, you're feeling good, and then all of a sudden you're like, man, am I tired? That's when your body's switching over from burning through all of its excess carbohydrate fuel, or our glucose, into our fats. We have that dip, and then all of a sudden our energy picks up, because then we're able to utilize that fat by breaking some of those hydrocarbon bonds and utilizing the energy through the process of cellular respiration. Fat also serves as a good insulation for our organs. So our organs need some cushion, so they're not just getting moved around everywhere. So they do serve for insulation of organs, insulation in general. So especially marine mammals and organisms that live in areas that are very cold, they'll typically have a thicker layer of fat. In marine mammals, we call that blubber, and they have a very thick layer of blubber that helps them to maintain their body temperature in those colder areas. All right, so let's talk about fat. So this is the first form of lipids that we're going to be discussing. Now, you've probably heard about saturated fat and unsaturated fat, and you may be a little bit confused about what they are. So the way I always like to remember it is saturated fat is really heavy and dense. Unsaturated fat is a little bit more light, free flowing, just like the oil. So saturated fat does not have any double bonded carbons in the fatty acid tail. It's going to be solid at room temperature. So for example, butter and lard. Those are going to be our saturated fats. Typically they come from animal fat. So any type of animal product is typically going to be considered a saturated fat. Now, unsaturated, a little bit more free-form, free-flowing. All right, those are going to be liquid at room temperature. They have one or more double bonded carbons in the fatty acid tail. And again, they're liquid at room temperature. So for example, our olive oil, we have avocado oil, grapeseed oil, all of those healthy oils are healthy fats. So then we also have our unsaturated and saturated. For our unsaturated fats, like I said, they have that carbon-to-carbon double bond. This makes them a little bit lighter. They're not fully saturated with all of those hydrogen atoms. So we find these in plants and in fish fats. So you're always hearing about like the healthy omega-3 fatty acids in fish. Well, those are the healthy fats. These are, again, most of the time they're liquid at room temperature. And the kink that's made by this double bonded carbon prevents those fatty acid tails from packing very closely together. So it makes them, again, not quite as dense. And I, again, like to remember that is that those unsaturated fats, a little bit more free-flowing, saturated fats are very dense and put together. So taking a closer look at our saturated fats, all of those carbons are going to be occupied by a hydrogen. So there's not going to be any double carbon-to-carbon bonds in the fatty acid tail. So this is going to lead to very straight chains. And again, this is mostly going to be animal fats. They're solid at room temperature. And because those fatty acid chains are very straight, they can tack very closely together. And that's what makes them so dense and saturated. Because of the structure of these, it can contribute to cardiovascular disease, to clogging our arteries. And so these are the types of fats that you should eat in moderation and not overconsume. So next up, we have the phospholipid bilayer. Again, this is something that people don't typically think about when they hear the word lipid, but all of our cell membranes or plasma membranes are composed of these phospholipids. So they have a very important structure. They have a polar head, so made out of a phosphate. So we have this phosphate, our polar head, meaning that it is hydrophilic. It's water loving. They love the water, they have a charge, they are polar. This is a molecule where we have some of a charge that's going to be negative and partially positive. So again, a polar molecule, we have that polar head, and that's going to be negatively charged overall. We were talking about our water in a previous lecture. The water has a slightly negative charge on the oxygen and slightly positive charges on the hydrogen that makes it polar. So this too, this phosphate, even though it's negatively charged, we consider it polar because it has a charge. So the function of that is it's going to create a barrier in the water, and it's also going to help to define the outside versus the inside. And again, those phospholipids compose that cell membrane. Now the tail right here is going to be non-polar, meaning it's going to be water-fearing or hydrophobic. So it's going to be scared of water, or it hates water. It's not going to be charged at all. So again, we're going to have this phosphate head that has a charge. It's polar, it's water-loving, and then we have this tail. And then the tail is going to be hydrophobic, it's water-fearing, and it is non-polar. So we call this amphipathic, meaning it has these two different parts of it. So again, we have the fatty acid tails that are hydrophobic, they fear the water, and those are going to be non-polar. They repel the water. Whereas we have the phosphate heads that are hydrophilic, they love the water, and they're attracted to it, and those are polar. Whenever these come together, it's really cool because they can actually self-assemble, and they self-assemble into these little bubbles that we call micelles. And so they actually form these little layers called a micelle. And then in our plasma membranes, they form this phospholipid bilayer. And again, we have these phosphate heads that are polar, they're water loving, and then we have the hydrophobic tails that do not like the water, and they do not have a charge. So last but not least, as far as different types of forms of lipids, we have steroids/hormones. Pump you up. So steroids and hormones function in self-signaling across the body. So different hormones can be released. So we might need to release insulin. We might release adrenaline if we need to go into our fight or flight or fear mode. So we're going to release those hormones from different organs within our body. And again, they function in cell-to-cell communication, but they are also lipids. So the structure of a steroid, we have our 4 fused carbon rings, and then we have a functional group. Kind of like amino acids, those functional groups or the R groups in amino acids are going to give them their individualized properties. So in steroids, those functional groups are going to make one steroid different from the other. Different steroids are going to attach to different functional groups. Different functional groups have different structures, and when we have different structures, it leads to different functions that happen throughout our body. So just to name a couple of different hormones that we have cortisol, which is our stress hormone, which some of you might be stressed now. You might be reviewing for an AP biology test. You might be stuck in the middle of a global pandemic. If you're watching this and you knew what 2020 was. So we also have aldosterone. We have testosterone, which is obviously a sex hormone, as well as estrogen. We have estradiol. We have progesterone. And like I said, we also have other hormones such as insulin and oxytocin. So there's a wide array of hormones that are fluctuating in our bodies at all times, and those are also lipids. And the form of those are going to be our steroids. So as a quick little review, all lipids are composed of hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. Now, when we talk about our phospholipids, those also have phosphorus in them because they have those phosphate heads that go on to the phospholipid bilayer, and then they have their hydrophobic tails that do not like water. So again, we have hydrogen, we have oxygen, and we have carbon. They make these super long hydrocarbon chains. So we have lots of carbons and hydrogens linked together, and that's where you saw those little kink, 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 those up, down, up, down, up, down, and those represent the carbon. So each of the points would represent the carbon. So as far as a monomer, we have a glycerol and those 3 fatty acid chains. Now, we don't technically have polymers for fats, but if you're asked for the polymer of a fat, because sometimes in curriculum it refers to them as polymers, you could state a triglyceride, phospholipids, and steroids. Now, those are also referred to as the different types of forms of a lipid. So again, triglycerides, phospholipids, and steroids. And then finally, the function. Again, they serve for insulation. So they help to insulate our organs or protect our organs, and they also serve to protect us from the cold. We have fats for our long-term energy storage, so letting us utilize that if we run through all of our carbohydrates. And they also make up our cell or plasma membranes, and they serve for cell-to-cell communication. So I hope that was helpful. For more exciting videos that are slightly dorky from the Queen Nerdling, go ahead and visit www.nerdlingscience.com. I hope all of you have a great day, and see you next time.